She slammed the last quilt down on Harlan Briggs's counter so hard the tin coffee cups rattled off the shelf. "You look me in the eye," Maddie Whitaker said, her voice shaking not from fear, but from something older and harder than fear. "And you tell me there is a single stitch in that whole trunk that ain't worth every penny I'm asking." Harlan didn't look her in the eye. He looked somewhere past her left shoulder, the way men do when they've already made up their minds and don't want to be bothered defending it. "Ain't about the stitching, ma'am." "Then what's it about, Harlan? Because I got 12 quilts, 4 wool-lined coats, and 6 blankets thick enough to keep a man alive in a January norther, and you're standing there telling me you can't move a single one before winter hits." He finally looked at her. Not at her work, at her. And Maddie understood then the way a woman understands things she spent years trying not to understand exactly what this was about. If you've ever been told your work wasn't good enough by someone who never looked at it, if you've ever walked into a room and felt the walls close in before you opened your mouth. Stay with me. Subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Because what happened to Martha Whitaker in Abilene, Kansas in the winter of 1879 is the kind of story that doesn't stay buried. And it starts right here. The trunk weighed 80 pounds on flat ground. On the frozen ruts of Meridian Street, with a north wind cutting down from the plains, hard enough to lean into it, weighed considerably more. Maddie Whitaker had been dragging it since before sunup, one hand gripping the rope handle she'd knotted herself, the other arm swinging for balance, her boots finding purchase on the icy-packed dirt one deliberate step at a time. She didn't stop to rest. She'd learned a long time ago that stopping made it harder to start again. Abilene was not a big town. 3 blocks of storefronts, a livery, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse on weekdays, 2 saloons that didn't double as anything respectable. The kind of town where everybody knew everybody else's business before they knew their own, and where a woman arriving alone with a trunk full of goods and no husband in sight was either widowed or ruined, and the town would decide which before she'd had a chance to speak. Maddie was widowed. 4 years now. She'd kept the farm going alone for 3 of those years. Kept it going through 2 dry summers and a cattle fever that took 6 of her 8 animals. Kept it going through the kind of loneliness that doesn't announce itself, but just settles in. Like weather, until the bank had finally done what the weather and the fever and the loneliness hadn't quite managed, and taken the whole thing from under her in September. She was 34 years old. She had 12 quilts, 4 coats, 6 blankets, $14.30, and no intention of asking anyone for a single thing she hadn't earned. The first store was Briggs General Merchandise. She'd heard Harlan Briggs was fair. She'd heard wrong. She got the trunk through the door on the second try, the bell above it jangling twice, and she stood inside, breathing in the smell of tobacco and dried goods and coal smoke while her eyes adjusted. 2 men at the counter turned to look at her. A woman browsing bolts of calico turned to look at her. Harlan Briggs himself came out from behind a curtained doorway, wiping his hands on a rag, and he looked at her too, and every single one of them had the same expression, not unfriendly exactly, just assessing in that particular way that meant she was being measured against some standard she hadn't been told about and was already coming up short. "Morning," Maddie said. "I'm looking to speak with the owner about carrying some goods on consignment." "That'd be me." Harlan tucked the rag in his apron pocket. "Harlan Briggs, what have you got?" "Quilts, blankets, wool-lined coats." She opened the trunk. The top quilt was her best, a double wedding ring pattern in deep blue and cream, the stitching so fine and even it looked almost machine-made, which it was not. She lifted it out and laid it across the counter. All hand-stitched. The coats have a full wool lining, double reinforced seams, and a collar that buttons up over the chin. I've made 15 of these coats over the past 2 years. 14 of them are still being worn. I know because I've seen them. Harlan looked at the quilt. He reached out and turned back one corner, looked at the stitching, turned it back. "It's fine work," he said. "I'll give you that." "Thank you. But I don't know that I've got the call for it. Got 3 bolts of yard goods right there. Women make their own. Women who have time make their own," Maddie said. "Women whose husbands haven't taken sick, women who aren't putting up the last of the harvest, and mending harness, and breaking ice on the water trough before the sun's up. I've got coats that'll keep a man warm in weather that'd kill him otherwise. I've got quilts that'll last 15 years. You've got customers coming in here right now thinking about winter, and I can give you something to sell them." Harlan picked up the quilt, looked at it again, set it down. "I might could take 2 on consignment," he said. 30%. Maddie had done the arithmetic before she'd ever left the rooming house that morning. 30% consignment on a $2 quilt meant 60 cents per piece, paid only if it sold paid on Harlan's schedule, no advance, no guarantee. It meant she'd need to sell 4 just to cover 3 days of lodging and food. 40%, she said. "And I'd like to leave 4 pieces, not 2. 30's standard." "Then I'll find somewhere that isn't standard." She began folding the quilt back. "I appreciate your time, Mr. Briggs." "Now hold on." He put a hand out, not touching her, just gesturing. "I said I might could take 2. Let's not be hasty." "I'm not being hasty. I'm being precise. I've got 12 quilts, 4 coats, and 6 blankets in that trunk, and I need to move them before the real cold hits. If you can't give me fair terms, I need to use this time finding someone who will." He looked at her again, that same assessing look, slower this time. 40%, he said finally. "But I'll take 3, not 4. And I can't promise when they'll sell." "I understand that." She laid the quilt back on the counter. "I'll leave the double wedding ring, the log cabin in red and brown, and one of the wool coats. I'll come back in 3 days." She was back on the street in 20 minutes. 60 cents possible, no certainty. A trunk still heavy with everything she hadn't been able to leave. The wind had picked up. She turned up the collar of her own coat. Not one of the sale pieces, her personal coat, older and worn thin at the elbows. And she looked down the street at the next storefront. She went there next, and the one after that. By noon, she had placed 5 quilts on consignment at 2 different stores and sold exactly nothing. She'd been told her prices were too high. Her patterns were old-fashioned. Her coats were a nice idea, but the winter probably wouldn't be that bad this year. And once by a man who smiled while he said it, which made it somehow worse that she might do better selling in a bigger town where there were ladies with more refined taste. She ate lunch standing up a heel of bread and a piece of hard cheese she'd brought from the rooming house, standing in the alley between the hardware store and the feed merchant, because she didn't want to spend money on a meal, and she didn't want anyone to see her eating in the street. She was still eating when she heard them. 3 cowboys, maybe 4, coming out of the saloon across the way. Young men that particular age where confidence runs ahead of sense, loud, in the way men get when they're performing for each other. "Lord Almighty," one of them said, and Maddie knew without looking that he meant her. She knew the way you know thunder before you hear it. "What do you haul in that trunk, Lady Boulders?" She didn't look up. She finished chewing, swallowed, took another bite. "Must be her lunch," another one said, and they all thought that was very funny. She ate the last of the cheese. She folded the cloth she'd wrapped it in and put it in her coat pocket. She picked up the rope handle of the trunk. "Hey, now I'm talking to you." She looked at him then. He was maybe 22, red-faced from the cold and the whiskey, both grinning the grin of a man who has never once considered that what he finds funny might not be funny to everyone. "I heard you," Maddie said. "I just didn't have anything to say back." That made his friends laugh, which made his grin tighten. Awful bold for a woman dragging a box down an alley. Awful loud for a man with nothing worth saying. She turned away and started pulling the trunk toward the street. "What's in the box?" He stepped forward and she heard his boots on the frozen ground and she stopped. She turned around again. "Quilts," she said. "Blankets. Wool-lined coats. All handmade, all first quality. All for sale at fair prices. You need any of those things?" He blinked. Hadn't expected that. "I don't need no quilt from you." "Then I'll thank you to let me get on with finding someone who does." She held his eyes for a moment, long enough to make it a statement rather than a retreat, and then she turned around and pulled the trunk out onto the street. She heard one of them say something behind her. She didn't look back. The afternoon went better slightly. A woman named Clara Hess, who ran a small dressmaking shop on the far end of Meridian Street, came outside when she saw Maddie struggling with the trunk on the icy steps and held the door open without being asked. "Let me see what you've got," Clara said, and she meant it. She went through the remaining pieces, slowly feeling the seams, checking the tension of the stitching, holding the coats up, and examining the collar construction. "Who taught you this buttonhole stitch?" she asked. "My grandmother. She was from Pennsylvania, German settlers. It shows. I haven't seen this done right in 10 years. Clara set the coat down. "I can't take them on consignment. I don't have the floor space and I don't have the foot traffic, honestly. But I'll buy one coat outright. Right now." Maddie's chest tightened. "What price?" $3. It was fair. More than fair, really, for outright purchase. Maddie had been asking $3.50 on consignment, which meant she'd expected to see maybe $2 after the merchant's cut. $3, Maddie said. "Yes." Clara counted it out from a small box under her counter. 3 silver dollars, cool and solid in Maddie's palm. "You should be selling to the ranchers," Clara said, not looking up from the box. "Not the town merchants. The ranch wives, the hands, the foremen. They're the ones who need what you're making. Town merchants want something pretty to put in a window. Ranch people want something that works." "I don't know the ranchers." "No, but they ride through town." Clara closed the box. "You could stand at the livery some morning, early, before the stores open." Maddie looked at her. "Thank you," she said. It came out more quietly than she intended, weighted with something she hadn't meant to let show. Clara looked up then, and something passed between them, one woman to another, the specific understanding of what it costs to do the practical thing instead of the proud thing. "Don't thank me," Clara said. "I got a good coat for a fair price. We're even." The sun was low when Maddie got back to the livery, not to sell, just to stable the trunk for the night with the landlord's permission. Her arms ached from shoulder to wrist. The cold had worked its way through her coat in the last hour and settled somewhere in her lower back. She was calculating, as she always was calculating, the remaining distance between where she was and where she needed to be. $14.30. Now $17.30. 3 quilts placed at 2 stores. No sales yet. 4 coats still in the trunk. Lodging at 50 cents a night, food to account for. She was still calculating when she heard the voice. "Ma'am?" Low voice. Careful. The way a man speaks when he's been raised to speak that way, and it's become habit rather than performance. She turned. He was standing just inside the livery door, a tall man, broad through the shoulders, wearing a coat that had seen hard use and a hat that had seen harder. 35, maybe a year or two either side. Dark eyes, a jaw that suggested he didn't smile easily, and the particular stillness of a man who doesn't move unless he's decided to. "I heard you had some work for sale," he said. "Quilts and such." Maddie straightened. 14 hours on her feet, and she straightened like she'd just started. "I do. Quilts, blankets, and wool-lined coats. All handmade, all full quality. Were you looking for something specific?" "Coats," he said. "I've got 6 hands and a foreman, and they're all going into a hard winter in gear that ain't going to hold." He paused. "And I've got 2 children who need quilts that'll last, not fall apart by February." Maddie opened the trunk. She watched him look at the coats. The way Clara had looked at them, not decoratively, not quickly, but with the attention of someone who understands what they're looking at. He checked the seams. He checked the collar. He put one arm in a sleeve and felt the lining. "Wool all the way through?" he asked. "Full lining, carded and stitched down so it won't bunch or shift. The outer layer is heavy canvas. It'll cut wind and it'll shed light rain. It won't do for a soaking, but nothing will. How long'll it hold? 5 years minimum if it's kept reasonably, 7 or 8 if it's dried proper and not left wet." He set the coat down. He looked at her. "I'll take 4 coats," he said. $3.50 apiece, and 2 quilts at $2.50 each. Maddie did the arithmetic. $19. More than she'd made in the previous 3 weeks combined. "That's fair," she said, and her voice stayed level, which cost her something. "I'm Caleb Rohr," he said. "I run the double R about 8 miles northwest." He reached into his coat. I'll pay you now cash, and I'll send a wagon in 2 days for the goods. Will that suit? It'll suit. He counted out the bills without ceremony, without looking at her the way Harlan Briggs had looked at her without the assessment. Just a transaction clean and square, one person to another. He handed her the money. You do good work, Mrs. Whitaker. Martha Whitaker. Maddie. Mrs. Whitaker. He nodded once, the nod of a man who has made a decision and is satisfied with it. I'll send that wagon Thursday morning. He turned and walked out of the livery. Maddie stood in the cold with $19 in her hand and the trunk at her feet, and the sound of the wind finding all the gaps in the livery boards. She had not cried once in the 14 hours since she'd left the rooming house that morning. She'd been refused, ridiculed, assessed, and dismissed, and spoken to like she was an inconvenience in a landscape, and she had not once let a single thing show, except what she intended to show. She stood there now, with $19 in her hand, and she thought about Clara Hess holding the door, and she thought about $3 silver cool in her palm, and she thought about a man who had looked at her work instead of her face, and she pressed her lips together hard. She had 7 quilts left. 3 placed on consignment with no certainty. 4 coats sold outright. 6 blankets. Enough to keep going another week, maybe 10 days if she was careful. Outside, the wind picked up and drove a sharp gust through the open top of the livery door, and Maddie felt it in her teeth and her back and her hands. She closed the trunk, wrapped the rope handle around her wrist, and started thinking about Thursday. Thursday came with iron skies and a wind that meant business. Maddie was at the livery before the wagon arrived, trunk already packed and roped, every piece folded, the way she'd folded things her whole life, tight, clean, no wasted space. She'd been up since 4, not because she needed to be, because lying still in the dark, listening to the rooming house settle and creak, had become harder than moving. The wagon rolled in at 7:30. A young hand, maybe 19, with a gap between his front teeth, and a hat 2 sizes too big, climbed down and looked at the trunk and looked at her and said, "Mr. Rohr sent me for a load of quilts and coats, ma'am. That's it." He loaded it without complaint, which she appreciated. Some men made a performance of lifting heavy things in front of women. He just lifted it. He said to tell you the money was good and the work better, the boy said, which was not something most employers told their hands to relay, and Maddie filed that away without comment. She watched the wagon roll north out of town, and then she turned back toward Meridian Street, because she had work to do, and 4 days before, she'd need to pay lodging again. Briggs General had sold 1 quilt. She knew before she walked in, because she'd been counting days and calculating foot traffic, and thinking about the kind of woman who walked into a general store in early November in a Kansas cow town and spent $2 on something she could theoretically make herself. She'd figured 1, maybe 2, and she'd been right. The log cabin sold, Harlan told her. He didn't look pleased about it, which was interesting. Some men couldn't stand being proven right by someone they'd expected to be wrong. Woman came in Tuesday, took 1 look at it, said it was the finest thing she'd seen in a year. That's good to hear. Here's your 40%. He counted 64 cents onto the counter. She took it. The double wedding ring still here. Still here. Give it another week. If it hasn't moved by then, I'll take it back and try somewhere else. He nodded, and she could see him working something out behind his eyes, some adjustment to whatever story he'd been telling himself about her, and she didn't wait for him to finish working it out. She had 3 more stops to make. The second store had sold nothing. The merchant, a thin, nervous man named Ober, who apologized for everything, including the weather, told her he'd had several people look at the coats and express admiration and then not buy them, which was the retail experience, summarized in a sentence. She took both pieces back. No point leaving them with someone who didn't believe in them. The third stop was not a store. She went because Clara Hess had told her to, and because $19 from Caleb Rohr, notwithstanding, she needed to keep moving product, and because standing still had never once solved a problem for her in her life. The livery at the north end of town opened its doors at 6 in the morning. By 7, ranchers and hands coming in from the surrounding properties had already been through stabled horses, picked up supplies, headed back out. Maddie was there at 6:30, with 3 quilts folded over one arm and 2 coats draped over the other, and the expression of a woman who had not come to ask permission. The liveryman, a square-built man named Pete Darden, watched her set up in the corner of his yard with the expression of someone who had been surprised enough times in his life that he'd stopped wasting energy on objection. "You selling," he said. "Trying to?" "Don't block the gate." "I won't." She didn't block the gate. She stood to the right of it and let people come to her, which was not how she'd expected it to work, but turned out to be how it worked. The first man to stop was a foreman from a spread south of town who looked at one of the coats for 45 seconds and bought it without negotiating. The second was a ranch wife who ran her fingers over the quilt stitching and said, "Lord, who made this?" And when Maddie said she had, the woman looked at her with the specific respect one skilled person gives another. She bought the quilt and asked if Maddie had more. "I have more back at my lodging." "I'll take 2 if they're like this one." By 9 o'clock she'd sold 2 coats, 2 quilts, and 1 blanket, and had orders for 3 more quilts from women who'd heard from the ranch wife and sent word through the particular network that existed between women in isolated places. The network that ran faster and more reliably than the telegraph. She was counting money in Pete Darden's tack room, sitting on a nail keg with the bills spread on her knee, when she heard the voice she recognized. "Didn't expect to see you here." She looked up. Caleb Rohr was standing in the doorway, hat in hand, his horse visible behind him, already tied to the rail. He'd come in from the northwest, and she hadn't heard him, which meant she'd been more focused on the counting than she'd realized. "Mr. Rohr." She stood up, which was habit, and then felt faintly annoyed at herself for the habit. "Sit down," he said not unkindly. "You look like you've earned it." He looked at the bills in her hand. "Good morning. Better than yesterday. Your coats made it back to the ranch last night. My foreman Deke put his on this morning and told me to tell you it was the finest piece of work he'd worn in 10 years. Coming from Deke, that's significant. Deke doesn't find much to admire. The construction holds in cold. Said he forgot he was outside." That's a direct quote. Something shifted at the edge of his mouth. Not quite a smile, close to one. "He also said to ask if you'd make 2 more in his size. He's got a chest like a barrel, and nothing ever fits him right." Maddie pulled out the small notebook she kept in her coat pocket and uncapped the pencil. "What's his measurement?" Caleb blinked. He'd expected something else she could tell. Modesty, maybe. Deflection. Women who made things were supposed to be grateful and a little surprised when people wanted more of the things they made. "I don't rightly know," he said. "I'd have to ask him. If he can get to town in the next 2 days, I can measure him directly. Otherwise, have him measure chest-shoulder width and arm length from the back of the neck to the wrist, and I'll work from that." He nodded, and this time, the almost smile made it all the way. "I'll tell him." He bought a blanket while he was there. Didn't make a production of it, just asked the price and paid it the same clean transaction as before. She noticed that about him, no theater, no performance. Just decision and action. After he left, she sat back on the nail keg for a moment and looked at the money. She had $47. She'd arrived in Abilene with 14. She let herself feel that for exactly 30 seconds, and then she put the money away and started thinking about materials. She needed more wool. She needed more canvas if she was going to make good on the coat orders. She had thread enough for another 2 weeks, but needles were running low. The rooming house was 50 cents a night, and she'd paid through Sunday. But after Sunday, she'd need to either renegotiate or find somewhere cheaper and cheaper. In Abilene meant the kind of place where things went missing and the locks didn't hold. She was making a list in her notebook when the door to the tack room opened again, and this time it was not Caleb Rohr. It was a woman she didn't know. 40, maybe 45, wearing a good coat, not one of Maddie's something store-bought, and the expression of someone who had made a decision on the walk over and was still committed to it, but was less certain than she'd been. "Are you the woman selling quilts?" she said. "I am. Agnes Pruitt." She didn't extend a hand, just stood in the doorway. "My husband is Thomas Pruitt. He owns the Pruitt Land Company on 2nd Street. Maddie waited. "I want to be direct with you," Agnes said. "Please. There's talk about a woman selling goods out of the livery yard without a license. without any kind of arrangement with the town merchants. Maddie closed her notebook. What kind of talk? The kind that comes from men who feel that something that should be their business isn't. Agnes's voice was precise, careful. Harlan Briggs has been telling people your goods are inferior, and you've been misrepresenting them. Obert has been saying you pressured him to take consignment under unfair terms. Neither of those things is true from what I can see, but that's not the point. What is the point? Agnes looked at her steadily. The point is that you've sold more goods in 2 days than either of those stores sells in a month, and people have noticed, and some of them are not pleased about it, and you should know that before it becomes a problem, you haven't anticipated. Maddie sat with that for a moment. I appreciate you telling me, she said. I'm not telling you to leave. Agnes came a step further into the tack room. I'm telling you because I bought one of your quilts this morning, the double wedding ring from Briggs. He hadn't actually sold it. He'd just moved it to the back room. I had to ask to see it, and I've been making quilts for 20 years. And I have never not once seen this standard of work from someone selling out of a trunk. She stopped. My daughter is getting married in the spring. I want a quilt made specific for her. Not what you have on hand. Something made to order. The silence in the tack room was a different kind of silence than it had been a minute ago. I can do that, Maddie said. I'll pay in advance. Half now, half on delivery. I'll need her colors and some idea of the pattern she'd prefer. She wants whatever you think is best. Agnes said it like it was a simple sentence, and not the most generous thing anyone had said to Maddie in years. I'll tell her the woman who made it knows what she's doing. After Agnes left, Maddie sat still for longer than 30 seconds. Then she heard the shouting. It started outside in the livery yard, and it was a man's voice, and it had the particular edge of a man who'd been drinking enough to make him brave and not enough to make him slow. She was on her feet before she'd made the decision to stand. In the yard, one of the cowboys from the day before, not the red-faced one, a different one, older, meaner in a quieter way, had his boot on her trunk, not standing beside it, on it. "This your junk," he said when she came out. "Get your boot off my trunk." "Just asking a question." He didn't move the boot. Somebody been leaving things laying around the yard blocking people's way. "The trunk is in the corner. It isn't blocking anything." "Seems to me it's blocking the spot where I want to stand." He smiled at the man beside him. "Funny how that works." Pete Darden was across the yard and moving, but not fast enough. Maddie walked to the trunk, reached down without any ceremony whatsoever, lifted his boot with both hands, and set it off the trunk and onto the ground. It was not a gesture. It was a fact. The yard went quiet. The cowboy looked at his boot on the ground and then at her. And for 1 second, she saw the calculation happen behind his eyes, the weighing of what he could do against what she'd already done. And in that second, she looked at him with the patience of someone who has been tired for a very long time and has decided to stop pretending otherwise. "You got something to buy?" she said. Or something to say that's worth hearing. He didn't have either. She saw the moment he understood that which was the moment he looked away first. "Come on, Roy," his friend said quietly. And Roy came on. Pete Darden reached her a few seconds after they'd gone. "I'd have stepped in," he said. "I know," Maddie said. "It was fine." He looked at her with the careful look of a man revising something. "You're not what I expected when you showed up here this morning." "What did you expect?" He scratched the back of his neck. "Somebody who'd need more help than she asked for." "I might still need help," she said. "Just not that kind." She was back in her room at the boarding house by 6, eating a proper meal for the first time in 2 days. Beef stew from the kitchen downstairs. 2 rolls, a cup of coffee. She let get cold because she was too busy working in her notebook to drink it while it was hot. She had orders for 6 quilts. She had a custom commission. She had standing requests for 2 more coats including Deke's specific measurements. She had $47 and she'd arrived with 14. She also had, if Agnes Pruitt was right, at least 2 town merchants working against her, in ways she couldn't fully see yet. She thought about that for a long time. She'd known it was coming, not specifically not Agnes and the tack room and the trunk in the yard, but the shape of it. She'd known since she'd walked into Briggs General that first morning and seen Harlan's eyes go to her body before they went to her work. Men like Harlan didn't get over that kind of thing. They just found different ways to act on it. She wrote in her notebook materials, measurements, commission details for Agnes Pruitt's daughter, the price she would charge and the time it would take, and the margin she needed to clear. She wrote, find permanent workspace. She wrote, talk to the women. She underlined that last one twice, not because she'd forget it, but because she wanted to look at it in the morning and know she'd meant it the night before. She drank the cold coffee. She turned down the lamp. Outside, the wind was back harder now, carrying something colder than it had that morning. Something with weight to it, the smell of real winter finally making its intentions known. Maddie pulled her blanket up, not one of her sale blankets, her own older, thinner than she'd have sold to anyone. And she lay in the dark listening to Abilene settle around her, and she thought about the women, the ranch wives. Clara Hess, Agnes Pruitt in her good store-bought coat. The woman at the livery gate who'd run her fingers over the stitching and said, Lord, who made this? The women she hadn't met yet, the ones out on the spreads 8 and 12 and 15 miles from town, the ones who were good with their hands and had no market and no margin, and no one coming to their door to tell them their work was worth something. She knew what she was thinking. She'd been thinking it since the second day, maybe the first. She didn't know yet how to make it happen. But she'd learned in her 34 years that not knowing how was not the same as not knowing whether. She knew whether. The wind hit the window once hard like a question that expected an answer. She closed her eyes and let it ask. The snow came on a Sunday. Not a gentle snow, not the kind that settled quiet and made the world look clean. This was the kind that moved sideways, that found the gap between your collar and your neck, and drove itself in like a blade that turned the familiar geometry of a town into something unrecognizable in under an hour. Maddie woke to it at 5 in the morning when the wind hit the boarding house wall hard enough to shake the lamp on the bedside table, and she lay still for exactly 3 seconds before she was up and dressed. She'd been in Abilene 11 days. She had $61. She had a workspace she'd negotiated 3 days ago. A back room behind Clara Hess's dressmaking shop, $8 a month, access to the cutting table and the good lamp, and the understanding that the arrangement was provisional until both parties decided it wasn't. She had 6 quilts in progress, 2 coats cut, and waiting to be assembled. Agnes Pruitt's commission sketched out in the notebook she kept in her left coat pocket at all times. She had, if she counted carefully, the beginning of something that resembled a plan. What she did not have was time for a blizzard. She got to Clara's shop by 6, fighting the wind the whole 2 blocks, and let herself in with the key Clara had given her on Thursday, with the comment that she wasn't running a hotel, but she also wasn't going to make a woman knock in weather like this. The back room was cold, but out of the wind, and Maddie lit the stove and set water to heat, and spread the unfinished coat across the table, and picked up her needle before the room had fully warmed. She'd been working an hour when she heard Clara come in. "You're already here," Clara said from the doorway. "Couldn't sleep." "The snow woke me too." Clara came in and looked at the coat and looked at Maddie's hands. "You eat this morning." "I'll eat later." "You'll eat now." Clara disappeared and came back with bread and a boiled egg and set them on the corner of the table without comment. "I heard something last night you should know about." Maddie kept stitching. "What kind of something?" "Harlan Briggs filed a complaint with the town council yesterday afternoon. Said you'd been operating as a merchant without a license and undercutting established businesses." Clara sat down in the chair by the stove. "Council meets Tuesday." Maddie set down her needle. "He's got Obert to sign on with him," Clara continued, "and Ray Stills from the dry goods. 3 merchants together, that's enough for the council to take it seriously. What does a license cost?" "It's not about the money, Maddie. They'll make the terms whatever they need them to be to slow you down. There'll be a fee and a waiting period, and probably a requirement for a fixed premises." She paused. Which you'd have if this room counts. Does it count? I don't know. That's what they'll argue about. Maddie picked up the egg Clara had brought, cracked it on the table edge, peeled it in 4 clean pieces. Who's on the council? She said. 7 men. Thomas Pruitt is one of them. Agnes's husband. The man who owned the land company. Maddie ate the egg. She thought about Agnes standing in the tack room doorway saying, "I want to be direct with you." And she thought about Agnes's money paid half in advance for the commission. And she thought about the way Agnes had said, "My daughter wants whatever you think is best." Like it was simple. Is Thomas Pruitt the kind of man who votes the way his wife thinks he should? She said. Clara looked at her for a moment. He is the kind of man who thinks he makes up his own mind, she said carefully. But Agnes is the kind of woman who made up both their minds for the last 20 years without him noticing. Maddie nodded. She picked up her needle. Then I'll talk to Agnes this morning, she said. Before the snow gets worse. Clara opened her mouth and then closed it, which was the sound of a woman deciding not to argue with someone who had already decided. Agnes Pruitt's house was 4 blocks north, and by the time Maddie got there, the snow was past her ankles, and the wind was making conversation with itself in a loud and disagreeable way. She knocked, and Agnes answered in 30 seconds, which meant she'd been up and near the door, which meant she'd been expecting something, though probably not Maddie specifically. Come in, Agnes said, looking past her at the street. Good Lord! Inside the house was warm and smelled of coffee, and there were 2 small children at the kitchen table, eating porridge, and a girl of maybe 17 sitting by the window with a book she wasn't reading. Agnes's daughter Maddie guessed the one getting married in the spring. Sit down, Agnes said. Coffee. Please. And I need to talk to you about something. Agnes poured 2 cups and sat across from her, and Maddie told her straight through without softening what Clara had said. Agnes listened without interrupting, which was a skill not everyone had. When Maddie finished, Agnes was quiet for a moment. Harlan Briggs, she said finally, has not had an original idea in 15 years. Somebody put him up to this. Who? Agnes wrapped both hands around her cup. There's a man in this town named Silas Creed. He runs the freight contracts for most of the ranches in the county. Dry goods, hardware, fabrics. He's got arrangements with every merchant on Meridian Street. Exclusive arrangements. And you've been selling direct to ranch wives and foremen, which means you're cutting across every one of those arrangements without knowing you're doing it. Maddie hadn't known she was doing it. She thought about the ranch wife at the livery gate and Deke's coat measurement and the 6 orders she'd taken from women who'd heard from other women, and she understood now what she'd been doing from Silas Creed's perspective, which was eating his lunch without so much as a nod in his direction. I don't know Creed, she said. He knows you. Agnes set down her cup. He came to Thomas on Friday. Said you were a disruption to established trade in the county and something ought to be done about it. She paused. Thomas told him to take it to the council, which was either the right answer or the wrong answer, depending on how Tuesday goes. What happens if the council sides with Briggs? You'd have to operate through an established merchant. Consignment fixed percentage their schedule and their terms. Agnes met her eyes. Which puts you right back where you started, except now they'd know they had you. The kitchen was warm, and the children were eating their porridge, and outside the snow was doing what it intended to do, which was whatever it wanted. I need Thomas to vote against the complaint, Maddie said. I know, Agnes said. And I need something to tell him that makes it worth doing. Something that isn't just that his wife likes your stitching. Maddie thought for a moment. I'm going to employ women, she said. Within the month if things go the way I expect. I've got more orders than I can fill alone. I'm looking at 3 women already who've got the skill and need the income. If I'm operating legally with a fixed premises and a real payroll, that's a different thing to present to the council than a woman selling out of a trunk. Agnes looked at her steadily. You'd need the money to pay wages before the orders come in. I know. That's a risk. Yes. Agnes was quiet for a long moment. One of the children asked for more porridge, and the girl by the window turned a page she hadn't read. I'll talk to Thomas tonight, Agnes said. Maddie walked back to Clara's through the worsening snow, with her head down and the conversation turning over in her mind. She heard it, a child's voice, high and frightened, coming from the direction of the church. She stopped. It came again, thin against the wind, from the far side of the church building where the schoolyard was. She went toward it because she was someone who went toward things. The boy was 8 years old, maybe small for his age, and he'd gotten himself turned around in the whiteout between the schoolhouse door and wherever he was trying to go, and he'd sat down, which was the wrong thing to do. The worst possible thing. The thing that meant he'd been out in the cold long enough for his legs to start failing in the open yard, with the wind driving snow at him sideways, and his voice going smaller each time he called. Maddie reached him in 30 seconds. "Hey," she said, dropping to one knee in front of him. "Hey, look at me." He looked at her. His face was white, and his lips were going blue at the edges, and his eyes had the unfocused quality of someone very cold, who is trying very hard to stay present. "What's your name?" "James," he said. "James Roar." The name landed. She picked him up. Not gradually, not carefully, she stood up with him in her arms all at once, all 80-some pounds of cold, frightened boy. And she turned into the wind, and she walked. Her legs knew the way before her mind fully organized the direction. The church was closer than Clara's shop. She pushed through the church door with her shoulder unwilling to put James down, even to use her hands. And inside she lowered him onto the first pew and started working on his coat buttons. "Are you the lady with the quilts?" James said, because children sometimes say the thing that cuts straight to what matters. "I am," she said. "Papa said you make good coats." "Keep talking to me," she said, getting his wet outer coat off. "Tell me about your papa." The church had a stove in the corner that someone had kept banked, and she got it open and built the fire up one-handed while keeping her other hand on James's back, and by the time the Reverend came in from the back room at the sound of the door, she had the boy warming and talking and mostly present. "Good God," the Reverend said. "He's all right," Maddie said. "He needs warm, not panic." The Reverend nodded and went for blankets, which was the right response. And Maddie sat on the pew beside James and kept him talking, because talking meant breathing, meant staying warm, meant living. It was 20 minutes before the church door slammed open. Caleb Roar came through it like the storm itself had given him shape and thrown him in. He saw James first, which was right and correct, and he crossed the room in 3 strides and went to one knee in front of his son and put both hands on the boy's face, and for a moment he said nothing at all, just looked, just checked, just made sure. Then James said, "The quilt lady found me, Papa." Caleb turned. He looked at Maddie the way people look at someone when they're rearranging everything they thought they knew about them and trying to do it faster than is comfortable. "He was in the schoolyard," Maddie said. "He'd been down maybe 10 minutes. He's warming up fine." Caleb's jaw moved. He was working on something. She could see some collection of words that was harder to assemble than it should have been for a man who she'd already clocked as someone who chose words carefully. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said finally. "He's fine," she said again, because that was what mattered, and she could see he needed to hear it twice. "If you hadn't—" He stopped. "I was walking by," she said. "That's all." It was not all, and they both knew it was not all, but it was what she said, and he accepted it because sometimes the plain version of a thing is the kindest way to give it. James fell asleep on the pew 20 minutes later, warm under 2 of the Reverend's blankets, and Maddie stood up to go, because she had 6 quilts in progress and a stove that needed tending and a council meeting in 2 days. "Wait," Caleb said. She waited. He stood up from where he'd been crouched beside James, and he looked at her with something she hadn't seen on his face before. Not gratitude exactly, though it was that too. Something quieter and more unsettling than gratitude. "I owe you," he said. "You don't owe me anything." "I do." He said it simply the way he said everything, like a fact rather than a sentiment. "And I pay my debts. Whatever you need to make your business work in this town, you tell me." She looked at him. She thought about the council meeting, about Silas Creed and Harlan Briggs, and the shape of the thing that was being built against her, about women with skills and no market, and no one to tell them their work was worth something. "There's a council meeting Tuesday," she said. "I need people who'll speak for fair dealing." "I'll be there," he said. It was not a question, and it was not a promise that needed ornamenting. Outside, the snow was still coming. Inside the church, James Rohr breathed slow and even and warm, and Caleb Rohr looked at the woman who had carried his son out of the cold. And somewhere 2 blocks north in his own warm house, Thomas Pruitt was about to have a conversation with his wife that would matter more than he yet understood. Maddie pulled her coat on, wrapped her scarf twice, and pushed back out into the storm. She had work to do. The snow stopped Monday morning, but the cold it left behind was the serious kind, the kind that didn't apologize. Maddie was at Clara's shop by 5:30, with her needle already threaded, and Agnes Pruitt's commission spread across the cutting table. She had 36 hours before the council meeting, and 4 quilts to finish, and a speech to write in her head, while her hands did the work her hands knew how to do without being told. Clara came in at 7 with coffee and the expression of someone who had information they weren't sure was welcome. "Thomas Pruitt came by last night," Clara said. Maddie didn't look up from her stitching. "And he wanted to know how long you'd been using this room, whether we had a formal arrangement, what you were paying." Clara set the coffee down beside Maddie's elbow. "I told him $8 a month fixed premises operating as a legitimate merchant." "What did he say to that?" "He said he'd think about it." Clara paused. "Which from Thomas Pruitt is basically a yes. He doesn't think about things he's planning to vote against. He just votes against them." Maddie set down her needle and picked up the coffee. "There's something else," Clara said. "Silas Creed was at the hotel last night, meeting with Ray Stills and 2 men I didn't recognize. Pete Darden saw them going in." "What time?" "Late, after 9. Men who met after 9 in the back room of a hotel were not meeting to discuss the weather." Maddie knew that much without needing to know more. She also knew that whatever they were planning for Tuesday, it was more organized than a simple merchant complaint, and she'd been a fool to think 3 days of snow had slowed them down. She finished her coffee and picked up her needle. "I need to talk to Caleb Rohr today," she said. "He's in town," Clara said. "I saw his horse at the livery when I came in." She found him at Pete Darden's, which was becoming the place in Abilene where things actually happened, and she told him straight through what Clara had said about Creed's late meeting without softening any of it. He listened with his arms crossed and his hat in his hand, and the expression he wore when he was thinking, which looked from the outside like no expression at all. "Creed's been a problem for 3 years, he said when she finished. "He's got freight contracts with every spread in the county. Legal ones mostly. But there are ranchers who've been paying his rates because they don't know they have a choice, not because he's giving them fair value. Including you." "Not anymore." Something moved in his jaw. "I switched to the Hanover freight out of Dodge 18 months ago. Cost me less and arrived on time. Creed tried to call in a land note he held on my southeast pasture as retaliation. I paid the note off inside of 60 days. Maddie looked at him. "He holds land notes. On half the county. That's the part of his business most people don't talk about." Caleb put his hat back on. "He loans against land and cattle when ranchers are short rates that look manageable until they aren't, and then he owns the paper on properties worth 10 times what he lent. It's legal, and it's slow, and most people don't see what he's doing until it's already done." This was new information, and it landed with the particular weight of something that explained other things. "Agnes told me Creed went to Thomas Pruitt on Friday," Maddie said. "Said I was disrupting established trade." "He wasn't talking about your quilts." Caleb's voice was flat. "Your quilts are an excuse. He's been wanting a complaint on record against direct sales to ranches for 2 years. You gave him a case he could attach it to." Maddie stood with that for a moment. She'd arrived in Abilene 11 days ago, dragging a trunk full of quilts, looking for enough money to last through winter. She had not arrived looking for a fight with the man who held land notes on half of Haskell County. She had not arrived looking for any fight at all, but she'd learned in 34 years that some fights found you regardless of what you were looking for. "What happens to the ranchers if Creed keeps the freight monopoly?" she said. Rates go up every year. He adds fees that weren't in the original contract. By spring, most spreads are paying 30% more than Hanover charges for the same run. He paused. 3 ranchers have already sold out in the last 2 years. Creed bought 2 of the properties through a land company registered in Topeka, so the name's not on the deed. Maddie's notebook was in her left pocket. She didn't take it out. She'd remember this. "I'll be at the council meeting tomorrow," Caleb said. "And I've talked to 4 other ranchers who'll come. If Creed thinks it's going to be a quiet Tuesday morning, he's going to be disappointed." She nodded. She turned to go. "Mrs. Whitaker." His voice stopped her at the door. "James asked about you this morning. At breakfast. Wanted to know if the quilt lady was all right in the snow." Maddie looked back at him. "Tell him I'm fine," she said. "Tell him the snow didn't bother me much." The ghost of something crossed Caleb's face. "He also said, and I'm quoting, that you're the strongest lady he ever saw." She left before her face could do anything she hadn't authorized it to do. The council meeting was held in the back room of the town hall, which was also the room where elections were counted and disputes were settled, and once, according to Pete Darden, a horse had been brought inside during a tornado warning in 1874. It held maybe 40 people standing and smelled of old wood and kerosene. By 9 o'clock Tuesday morning, it held 63. Maddie counted. She was good at counting. She stood at the back with Clara on one side and Agnes Pruitt, who had come without being asked, and who had brought her daughter on the other. Caleb Rohr was up front with 4 ranchers she recognized from the livery yard, and 2 she didn't. Thomas Pruitt sat at the council table with 6 other men and looked at his hands, and then at his wife, and then at his hands again. Harlan Briggs presented the complaint. He'd written it out, and he read it, which meant he'd been coached because Harlan was not a man who wrote things out unless someone told him to. He talked about unlicensed vending and unfair competition and the disruption of established trade relationships, and he used the phrase established trade relationships 3 times, which was 2 more times than a man who'd come up with the phrase himself would have used it. Obert signed his name to a supporting statement, but didn't speak, which told Maddie everything she needed to know about Obert's actual investment in the outcome. Then Silas Creed stood up. She'd expected a louder man. Creed was 60, gray, well-dressed in a way that was precise rather than showy, and he spoke quietly, which was more effective than shouting in a room where everyone was already paying attention. He talked about the county's economic stability. He talked about the importance of regulated commerce. He talked about protection for established businesses that had served the community for years. He never once looked at Maddie, which told her that he'd thought about her specifically because men who haven't thought about you look at you to reassure themselves you're not a threat. Men who have thought about you look away. When Creed sat down, Thomas Pruitt said, "Is there anyone who wishes to speak on the other side of this matter?" Caleb. Rohr stood up. He didn't read from anything. He stood up and he spoke the way he did everything directly, without theater, with the weight of someone who has chosen each word before opening his mouth. "Martha Whitaker makes the finest cold weather gear I've seen in 15 years of ranching in Kansas," he said. "My foreman wore one of her coats through Sunday's blizzard, and he's here to tell it, which he might not be if he'd been wearing what he had before. My son was out in that same storm." He paused. She brought him in. The room was quiet. "What I hear in this complaint," Caleb continued, "is that a woman doing skilled work and selling it at fair prices is a threat to men who've been charging unfair prices because nobody's offered an alternative. That's not a legal problem. That's a business problem. And the way you fix a business problem isn't to run the competition out of town, it's to do better." He sat down. 2 of the other ranchers stood up after him, shorter versions of the same argument, and then a woman Maddie didn't know stood up and said she'd bought a blanket at the livery yard, and it had kept her youngest warm through the coldest night of the year, and she'd like to know what exactly was illegal about that, and the council member on the far left had the expression of a man trying not to smile. Thomas Pruitt called for a recess. It lasted 12 minutes. Maddie spent them standing with her back against the wall and her hands still, because her hands wanted to be doing something, and there was nothing to do right now but wait. Clara leaned over. "It's going well." "It's going somewhere," Maddie said. "I don't know where yet." Agnes on her other side said nothing, just stood straight. When the council came back, Thomas Pruitt spoke first. He'd made his decision in the recess, and the decision was visible in the way he sat, the particular set of a man who has stopped deliberating and started acting. The complaint as filed doesn't demonstrate a violation of any existing town ordinance, he said. Mrs. Whitaker has been operating from a fixed commercial premises, paying fair rent, and selling goods she produced herself at prices the market has demonstrated are acceptable. He looked at Harlan Briggs. Consigning goods to an established merchant is not a requirement under current code. Moving direct to customers is not a violation. Harlan Briggs's face went through several colors. However, Thomas continued, the council does recommend that Mrs. Whitaker obtain a standard merchant license fee of $2, which formalizes her standing and protects her from future complaints of this nature. $2. It was nothing. It was exactly what it was meant to be. I'll pay it today, Maddie said from the back of the room, and several people turned to look at her, and she looked back at them with the expression of a woman who has been cold and tired and underestimated for a very long time, and has decided to let that be the last time. Silas Creed left the room without speaking. He walked out with the careful, controlled pace of a man managing something, and Maddie watched him go and filed the image away, because a man who left that quietly was a man continuing something in a different room, not a man who had stopped. She paid the license fee to the town clerk at 11 o'clock and walked back to Clara's shop with the paper in her coat pocket and the particular feeling of someone standing on ground that will hold. 3 women were waiting for her when she got there. She'd put out word through Agnes carefully, specifically to women she'd heard about from Clara and from the ranch wives at the livery. Women who sewed and had no market. Women who were good with their hands and had been told that wasn't enough. She'd sent word asking them to come at 11 Tuesday. No obligation, just a conversation. They'd all come. Ruth Kennedy was 42, a widow from 2 miles east, who made the cleanest buttonholes Maddie had ever seen when she asked her to demonstrate. Pearl Hofstede was 35, missing the first joint of her left index finger from a loom accident 10 years back, and able to work faster with 9 fingers than most people with 10. And Dorothea Mack was 60 and walked with a cane and sat down in Clara's best chair without being invited and said, "I've been making quilts since before your mother was born, girl. What do you want to know?" Maddie looked at the 3 of them. She told them what she had. Orders she couldn't fill alone. A merchant license issued that morning. A workspace that could take 2 more people if they weren't precious about elbow room. Fair wages, not consignment. She was specific about that because consignment was the word that kept women dependent on someone else's schedule and someone else's goodwill, and she was done with both. She told them what she needed. Skill and reliability and the willingness to work under her name while they built something that would eventually have all their names on it. Ruth asked about the wages. Maddie told her the number, and Ruth was quiet for a moment and then said, "That's more than my husband made at the grain store." "I know," Maddie said. Pearl asked about the hours. Maddie said she worked from first light to dark and expected the same, but the work was indoors and warm, and nobody would speak to them the way some of them had been spoken to in other situations. Dorothea Mack said nothing. She looked at Maddie over the top of her cane for a long moment, with the eyes of a woman who had been evaluating people for 60 years and knew exactly what she was looking at. "You'll do," she said finally, which was the best thing Dorothea Mack said to anyone, as Maddie would later learn, and was the moment that Whitaker Frontier Outfitters, though it didn't have that name yet, actually began. That evening, Caleb stopped by the shop on his way out of town. James was with him, sitting on the wagon seat, bundled in the coat Maddie had made, and when he saw her in the doorway, he raised one hand in a solemn wave, the wave of a child who has decided someone is worth acknowledging. Caleb swung down. "Council went well," he said. "It did. Thank you for speaking. Didn't say anything that wasn't true." He reached into his coat. "I've got 3 more orders from ranchers who were at the meeting. They want coats before December." He held out a folded paper. She took it. 3 names, 3 measurements written in a hand that was careful rather than elegant. You wrote the measurements yourself, she said. Deke dictated. I wrote. He almost smiled. He said to tell you the first coat is still perfect. She looked at the paper and she thought about Ruth and Pearl and Dorothea Mack waiting to start in the morning, and she thought about $61 becoming something with more rooms in it, and she said, tell your ranchers the coats will be ready. I know they will, he said. He climbed back up to the wagon seat. James waved again. The wagon rolled north into the dark and the cold. Maddie stood in the doorway until she couldn't hear the wheels anymore. She had a merchant license. She had 3 women starting in the morning. She had orders she could fill and orders she could grow into, and a plan that was becoming slowly something with weight and permanence. What she didn't have yet, what she could feel, moving at the edge of things the way you feel weather before it arrives, was the ending of Silas Creed. Because a man like Creed didn't leave a room quietly because he'd given up. He left quietly because he'd started something you couldn't see yet. And whatever it was already in motion. Creed moved on a Wednesday, which was either bold or careless, and Maddie decided it was neither. It was calculated the way everything Silas Creed did was calculated timed for the moment when she'd be most occupied and least watching. She found out from Dorothea Mack, who found out from her nephew who drove freight for the county and had ears that worked considerably better than his employers understood. Creed filed a civil lien yesterday, Dorothea said. She was sitting in her chair by the stove with her cane across her knees, and the expression of someone delivering bad news they have already processed and are now presenting as information rather than catastrophe. Against the double R, against Caleb Rohr's cattle. Maddie set down her needle. On what grounds? She said. An old freight contract. Caleb switched carriers 18 months ago, but Creed says there was a penalty clause for early termination that was never paid. Says he's owed $460, and if it ain't paid in 30 days, he's got the right to seize cattle equal to the value. The room was very quiet. Ruth and Pearl looked up from their work. Outside a wagon passed, and the sound of it faded, and the quiet came back. Caleb told me he paid off the land note, Maddie said. He did. The land note's clean. This is a different document. A freight contract, separate paper, different terms. Dorothea tapped her cane once on the floor. My nephew says the penalty clause was added to the contract after Caleb signed the original. Different ink, different hand. But it's got a signature on it that looks like Caleb's, and unless Caleb can prove it isn't, the lien stands. Maddie stood up. Where's the original contract? She said. Creed has it. Filed with the county clerk this morning. Where's Caleb? Still at the ranch, far as I know. Probably doesn't know yet. She was out the door in 30 seconds. She found him at the livery coming in from the northwest with 2 hands and a string of horses he'd brought in for winter shoeing, and she waited while he dismounted and said something to the hands, and then she walked to him directly because there was no version of this conversation that benefited from build-up, she told him. Straight through, the way she'd told Agnes about Briggs on that snowy Monday that already felt like another life, and he listened the same way. Caleb always listened, still contained processing behind eyes that gave nothing away until he'd decided what to give. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Penalty clause, he said. Added after signing according to my source. Different ink. I never agreed to a penalty clause. I know. I've got my copy of the original contract at the ranch. Something moved in Maddie's chest, a shift like a door opening. Does your copy have a penalty clause? No. His voice was very even. It does not. She looked at him. He looked at her. Then we need to get that document to Thomas Pruitt before the end of the day, she said, because Creed filed with the county clerk this morning, and the longer that lien sits on record, the more legitimate it looks. Caleb turned to his nearest hand. Ride back to the ranch. Get the green tin box from the desk in my office, the one with the freight papers. Don't stop for anything. Ride hard. The hand was gone before Caleb finished the sentence. They went to Thomas Pruitt together. Maddie and Caleb and Agnes let them in without asking why, because Agnes read situations the way some people read books quickly, and without needing to be told the title. Thomas came out of his office, and Maddie let Caleb speak first, because it was his cattle and his name, and she was there as witness and support, not as the primary voice, and she knew the difference. Caleb laid out the situation in 4 sentences. Thomas listened with the expression of a man who had suspected something was coming and was deciding whether being right about it was satisfying or alarming. "If you have an original contract without the clause," Thomas said, "and Creed has filed a document with a clause added that's forgery." "Yes," Caleb said. "That's a matter for the county sheriff, not the town council." "I know, but the lien is filed with the county clerk and you have standing to flag a dispute on the record before the sheriff gets involved. I need it flagged today, Thomas, before Creed moves on it." Thomas looked at his wife. Agnes said, "Do it today, Thomas." Thomas did it that afternoon. He filed a formal dispute on the lien citing pending evidence of document alteration which didn't remove the lien but put a legal question mark beside it that prevented Creed from acting on it while the matter was under investigation. It was the right move, and it bought exactly the time they needed. The hand arrived back from the Double R at 4 o'clock with the green tin box. Caleb's original contract had no penalty clause. The signature page was clean, witnessed by 2 names who were still in the county and still alive and still able to testify. Sheriff Donald Briggs, no relation to Harlan. A fact the sheriff mentioned regularly, took the 2 documents side by side and held them up to the window light and said in the voice of a man who had been doing this long enough to have seen most things, "Well, that's different ink, different hand, and a different margin width on the added paragraph. That's not subtle." "Creed didn't think he'd be compared to an original," Maddie said. The sheriff looked at her. "You work all this out yourself." "My source flagged the ink. I did the arithmetic on the timing." He looked at her for another moment with the careful look she was getting accustomed to from people in Abilene, the look that meant a recalibration was happening that they hadn't anticipated needing. "You got a name, ma'am." "Maddie Whitaker." "The quilt woman." "The merchant," she said. Not sharp, just precise. The sheriff almost smiled. "The merchant. Right." Creed was brought in for questioning on Thursday morning. By Thursday evening, the story had moved through Abilene the way stories move through small towns, which is to say faster than the people in them think possible. And by Friday morning there was not a merchant on Meridian Street who hadn't heard that Silas Creed had been filing altered contracts with the county clerk for an undetermined period, and that the sheriff's office was now looking at 3 other freight disputes that had settled quietly over the past 2 years, with the particular quiet of men who had been pressured into settlements they couldn't afford to fight. Harlan Briggs came into Clara's shop on Friday at 10 o'clock. Maddie was at the cutting table with Ruth and Pearl. 3 coats in stages of assembly, Dorothea Mack in her chair, with her needle moving at a pace that made the other women quietly competitive. Harlan stood in the doorway and turned his hat in his hands. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said. She looked up. She waited. He stopped. Started again. "I wanted to say that the complaint I filed was it wasn't right. Creed came to me and said you were taking business from the whole street, and I let him make the argument for me instead of thinking it through myself." The room was very quiet in the way rooms get when the people in them are choosing not to speak. "I appreciate you saying so," Maddie said. He nodded, working his hat brim. "I've still got your double wedding ring quilt. Woman came in yesterday and offered me $350 for it. I told her it wasn't mine to sell at that price. Thought you'd want to set the price yourself." Maddie looked at him for a moment. $4, she said, "and I'll give you 40%. Something shifted in his face. It wasn't quite relief, and it wasn't quite shame, and it was probably both. "That's fair," he said. "That's more than fair." "I know," she said, and she went back to work. December came in hard and stayed. The shop on Meridian Street, she'd taken a proper lease on a space 2 doors down from Clara Larger, with room for 4 people to work, and a front counter where customers could come without going through the workroom filled up fast. Not with browsers, with buyers. Ranch wives who came in from 15 miles out and spent an hour and left with coats and quilts and blankets and sometimes just stood in the warm room a while before going back out to the cold. Women who sent word with their husbands' hands and got their orders back the same way. Women who brought their daughters and pointed at the seams and said, "Look at how that's done, pay attention." Maddie paid wages every Friday. Not consignment, not a cut wages. Ruth cried the first Friday quietly facing the wall, and when she turned around, her face was composed, and she said she wasn't crying about the money, she was crying because she'd been doing this her whole life, and nobody had ever paid her for it before. Maddie said she understood because she did, and she went back to work because that was how you honored something, you kept building it. Dorothea Mack trained 2 of the younger women in the fine buttonhole stitch she'd learned in Pennsylvania in 1831, and watched them practice with the expression of a woman transferring something she'd carried a long time into hands that would carry it further. Agnes Pruitt's commission was finished the second week of December. Maddie delivered it herself, folded in clean linen, and Agnes unfolded it on the parlor table. And the daughter Elsie, 19, who turned out to be quieter and sharper than Maddie had expected, ran her hands over it and said simply, "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever owned." "It'll last longer than almost anything else you'll own," Maddie said. "Take care of it, and it'll outlast us both." Elsie looked up at her with the direct eyes of someone who meant what they said. "I'll take care of it." Caleb came to the shop on the 19th of December with James, who had appointed himself something of a regular visitor over the preceding weeks, and who now came in the way children come into places they consider partly theirs, comfortable and proprietary. Caleb had 2 things to say. The first was that the sheriff had confirmed 2 additional altered contracts in the Creed investigation, both involving ranchers who'd lost cattle in settlement, and that Creed was likely to face charges in the new year, and that Thomas Pruitt had already moved to have the fraudulent liens expunged from the county records. The second thing was harder for him to say, which was visible in the way he stood, the particular stillness of a man who is not uncertain about his decision, but is uncertain about the words for it. "I wanted to ask you something," he said. James had already migrated to Dorothea Mack's corner, where he sat on the footstool she kept beside her chair and watched her needle move with the focused attention of a child learning something without being taught it. Maddie waited. "I've got 2 children who don't have a mother," Caleb said. "I've got a ranch that runs well but runs cold in the ways that matter. And I've got—" He stopped. "I've been watching you for 6 weeks. Not the way people watch something they're uncertain about. The way you watch something you already know the value of, and you're just waiting to see if it holds." "Does it hold?" she said. "Every day," he said. "Every single day." She looked at him for a long moment. At the man who had bought her work before he knew her, who had spoken for her at a council meeting, because it was right, who had sent a wagon with a message that the work was good, and the worker better, who had looked at his son in a church pew with his hands on the boy's face and said nothing at all for 30 seconds. "James likes it here," she said. "James would move in if I let him," Caleb said, and the ghost of a smile was fully present now, no longer almost. "He told me this morning that Dorothea is teaching him to sew, and he intends to be good at it." Dorothea from her corner, without looking up, said, "He's already good at it. Better instincts than most grown men." James sat up straight on the footstool. Maddie felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't known was tight, some long-held brace against the expectation that things like this didn't happen, that the world was not constructed to give women like her this particular thing, that the work was the point, and the rest was for other people in other stories. "Ask me again in the spring," she said. "I'll ask you every day till spring if that's what it takes," Caleb said. "It won't take that long," she said. She went back to the cutting table. Her hands knew what to do. Ruth was humming something low and old. Pearl was counting seam lengths. Dorothea's needle moved without stopping. James sat on the footstool watching it all with the wide eyes of a child who is storing up a memory. Outside, December pressed its cold against the windows. Inside, the stove was going, and the lamps were lit, and the work was real, and the wages were fair, and the women who had been told for years that their hands were worth nothing were making things that would keep people alive through the hardest winter Haskell County had seen in a decade. Maddie Whitaker had arrived in Abilene with $14 and a trunk. and the unshakable knowledge that her work was worth something even when every door she knocked on said otherwise. She had not come to be saved. She had not come to be recognized. She had come to work, and she had worked, and what grew from the working was not luck, and it was not charity, and it was not a gift from any man or counsel or favorable wind. It was hers. Every stitch of it. And it would last.